During my junior year of high school in Denver, Colorado, I had an encounter with what I think was a reptilian. It happened on October 12th, 2003, while I was walking to catch the bus for school. While walking to the bus stop around 7 a.m., a very tall being appeared out of the woods. Quick note, the thick brush from which this figure appeared has marshes beyond it. So I saw this figure, and at first I couldn't quite make out what it was. But then I realized it had visible scales and was walking upright just like a man. Curious, but also very creeped out, I ignored it for a moment and tried to pull out my phone, which at the time was a Nokia brick phone, only to discover the battery was dead. Putting my phone back in my pocket, I decided to see who this person was, assuming it was someone who thought they were funny walking around in a costume. I figured it was a little early for Halloween, but you never know. Sometimes you get those weirdos walking around. As I got closer, this thing was no joke. This thing looked like someone's nightmare. Its skin was scalier than I had first thought, and it had little horns on top of its head and back. Not like ram horns or anything, but these little spikes. I guess that's how I can describe them. But most impressive to me were the whites of its eyes. They were like tiny, slit pupils. Now, I had never been afraid of much of anything before, but something told me in my gut that I needed to run. And now, I started running through the lot behind me, trying to get away from whatever this thing was. When suddenly a car passed by slowly. This thing didn't even seem to notice me, but turned to get a better look at the passing car. When it did, I noticed that its face was more human than I thought. When I saw its face and looked more intently, I felt weird and began running faster to my house. By the time I reached my front door, I don't think it was following me anymore. Now I had heard of weird stuff happening in my neighborhood. Other kids who went to school with me would always joke about what they would call the green man. Supposedly, a tall green lizard man who stalked the marshes and woods. I always thought it was ridiculous, and I'm not saying that's what I saw, but I'm going to tell you what happened next. So I started to tell my best friends about what I saw. Some of them believed me, some of them did not. But I think they could see how much it affected me. I mean, hell, I missed that whole day of school, and I wasn't going to dare tell my parents about what I witnessed. They would never believe me. The only choice I really had at the time was to share with a few of my close friends and primarily keep it to myself until all these years later when I developed an interest in cryptozoology and the paranormal. Thanks to sources like YouTube, which allows everybody and anybody to share their personal encounter stories and experiences, this is when I learned recently that I am not alone. In fact, I'm not crazy because I battled with that for years, convincing myself that it was just a strong hallucination or a bad nightmare, or a very vivid nightmare, I should say. Anyway, after hearing and learning everything that I have, and spending copious amounts of hours researching and diving deep into my past, I believe that reptilians are real. Maybe not in the traditional sense of humans transforming into reptile creatures, but maybe reptilian cryptids are an actual thing. I stand firm on my stance primarily because I've seen one with my own eyes. Anyone who lives in New Jersey knows we've got enough problems other than to worry about whether ghosts from our state's past are real or not. Hauntings, witches, I think we even have Bigfoot sightings. I don't know. Like I said, we've got enough problems. What I do know, I'll tell you, is the Pine Barrens. The pretty side of South Jersey might as well be another planet. Trees, bogs, eagles, and black bears. Yeah, the black bears have been showing back up. It ain't Newark, that's for sure. It's beautiful. It's a part of nature that most people don't think touches Jersey anymore. I like the Pine Barrens for that reason. That's also the reason I travel down once per season to the little town of Hamilton, blueberry capital of the world, or so the sign says. I believe it. Blueberries are the state fruit. That's another detail most people from the north side might stumble over. Not down in Hamilton. It might have something to do with the 50 million blueberries that come out of New Jersey each year, but down in Hamilton, people are in touch with that beautiful side of nature. So each year I take a trip, volunteer with the blueberry harvest, and find as many excuses as I can to explore the bogs and backwoods of the area. I find little souvenirs, usually rocks, and take them home as part of my collection. When I'm in a funk, maybe feeling the wear and tear of city life, I look over my collection and reminisce over the blueberry season. It helps maybe half the time. Scotch helps with the other half. This season, my souvenir means something a little different. Looking at the flat, oval-shaped rock with the porous red surface reminds me of what I escaped. It reminds me that, as well as I know the Pine Barrens, maybe I don't want the Barrens to know me. There were still blue stains on my fingertips when I entered the woods. I helped with the harvest that morning and had worked up a yearning for exploration. I was getting my fix as the trees grew dense enough to block out the buildings behind me. My eyes were already scouring the earth for a trinket that I could claim as my own. Most of the rocks in that area were exceedingly common. If I grabbed one of them, it would be hard to distinguish this trip from any other. I kept walking, deeper and deeper. I'd made the journey many times before. I still don't believe that I traveled too far into those woods. The ground around me still showed signs of being trampled by the other guests of Hamilton. I think maybe the thing that I saw wandered too close to town. I cursed under my breath when I first caught a glimpse of the animal and dropped down to one knee. It was a buck, or so I thought. I only saw its snout and rack creeping out from behind a mound of mud and brush. When it kept walking, the air hitched in my throat. Broad shoulders followed the head of the buck, broad enough that I could have mistaken the animal for a horse. Those shoulders, however, were covered in scales. I thought perhaps the animal I was looking at was diseased. I half crawled backward to give it a little more space. Then I saw the wings. Folded down the center of its back was a pair of massive bat-like wings. Leathery webbing, scaled and rigid arms. Was it a new species? The thing stood upright, hunched over and balancing on its hooved hind legs. Its anatomy was hard to comprehend at the moment. Even now, it feels like I'm imagining pieces of different animals that I've mistakenly assembled onto the same body. I wanted to vomit. I don't know whether it was the shock permeating through my body or the proximity to the creature itself, but all I could smell was sulfur. It burned my nose and lungs. I continued my backward crawl when it turned and saw me. My hand landed on something small and porous, and I tightened around it in case it was about to become the only weapon I had in a fight for my life. Its red eyes didn't look away. It stared a long while instead. It looked over my entire body. I felt like I was being measured. I knew everything from the sweat on my brow to the blueberry stains on my fingers was being judged and weighed against me. It wasn't a new species. It was old. I could feel its age in the look it gave me. I could tell that I wasn't the first human being that this beast had gazed upon. I wondered what had happened to all the others. This was one of the ghosts of my state, something strange and dangerous we worked to forget. And I was here, on the outskirts of its home, the place where nature started to reclaim civilization. There was some distant shouting from the direction I came, more volunteers pouring into the woods. The sound of the other men and women drew the animal's attention. Its eyes flicked warily to the space over my shoulder. Then it turned and ran away. My judgment came and went that quickly. I don't know how long I lingered there, but I do know that another hiker broke my trance when they placed a palm on my shoulder. I muttered some nonsensical excuse and left the woods. Porous and red. When I look at the rock that I carried home, I can't help but remember that creature. Was I as close to death as I felt? What sort of animal could that have been? I'll go back to Hamilton next year. It might be stupid, but I live in New Jersey, remember? Whatever that thing was, it didn't kill me then. Maybe I'll keep my distance when it comes to those woods, but I've got too many problems here in the city to just give up on my blueberry summers. A few years back, I was working as a forestry technician in West Virginia. My days were spent in the woods, monitoring tree health and whatnot. One evening in the fall, I was wrapping up some field work. As I was heading back to my truck, this eerie, high-pitched sound filled the air. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before. Curiosity tugging at me, I followed the sound until I reached a clearing. That's when I saw it. This thing was perched on a tree branch. It had a humanoid shape but was covered in dark, leathery skin. The wings, man, they were huge, like something out of a horror movie. And its eyes, they were red and seemed to glow. We stared at each other, and I felt like I couldn't move. Then in a whoosh, it spread its wings and shot up into the sky. The force of it nearly knocked me over. I hightailed it back to my truck, my heart pounding like a drum. The next day at work, I decided to report what I saw to my supervisor. I trusted him. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy. I told him the whole story, expecting him to take me seriously, but instead, he laughed. He said it was probably a big owl or a hawk, and my mind was playing tricks on me in the dim light. I insisted on what I saw, but he waved me off, telling me to lay off the scary movies. I couldn't let it go. Over the next few weeks, I asked around discreetly to see if any other forestry workers had seen anything similar. Most hadn't, but old Bill, a guy who'd been working there for decades, told me in hushed tones that he'd seen something similar years ago. He never reported it, said no one would believe him. I felt frustrated and isolated. I knew what I saw, but it felt like no one wanted to hear it. I started to dread going into the woods, always feeling like something was watching me. One evening, a couple of weeks after the incident, I was at the local diner trying to unwind with a cup of coffee. That's when I overheard a couple of hikers at the next table talking about strange sounds they'd heard in the woods. My ears perked up, and I couldn't help but approach them. I introduced myself and cautiously shared my story. To my surprise, they didn't laugh or brush me off. They looked genuinely concerned and shared that they'd heard similar stories from other hikers. We decided to form a small group to see if we could find any evidence of what was out there. We met up on weekends, talking to locals and taking short, cautious trips into the woods. One of the group members, Sarah, managed to get in touch with a local historian. He told us that there were old legends about a creature that was said to guard the forest, a being that could fly and had eyes that glowed like fire. As the weeks went by, our group grew closer. We were all bound by this shared experience and the need to find answers. We started calling ourselves the Guardians of the Woods, half-jokingly. One night, as we were camping near the clearing where I first saw the creature, we heard the high-pitched sound again. My heart raced as we all grabbed our flashlights and cameras. We didn't see the creature that night, but we found something, a feather. But it was unlike any bird feather I'd ever seen. It was large, black, and had an iridescent sheen that shimmered under the light. We decided to send it to a local university for analysis. Weeks later, we got a response that it didn't match any known bird species. Though we never saw the creature again, that feather was proof enough for me that something unexplained was out there. I eventually moved away, but I kept in touch with the group. We all went on with our lives, but that experience changed us. It opened our eyes to the mysteries that surround us. I don't know if I'll ever find out what that creature was, but I've made peace with that. I got a job near a large national park reserve in BC. Unfortunately, it was more than 2 hours away from the apartment I was renting at the time, so I had to move. The only rental, literally the only rental in town, was an old farmhouse out in the woods. I took the rental before even seeing it because it was my only option. The job was good enough that I didn't care about the house. I figured something else would come up soon enough, so it didn't really matter. That was my first mistake. The house was about 20 minutes from my new job, so not too bad there. However, it was about 7 kilometers down a dirt road deep in the forest. The house itself used to be part of a farm that was repurposed into a Girl Scout camp. The camp was subsequently moved elsewhere, and the main lodge was turned back into a house. Living alone in this big, old, lonely house in the middle of the woods was a bit creepy, I'll admit, but that wasn't the worst part. Not by a long shot. The worst part was at the end of the road. I was the last house on that road, but the road extended for another 2 kilometers before abruptly ending in the woods. And there, at the end of the road, was where the town dumped all of the roadkill from the nearby freeway. None of this was disclosed to me before I agreed to rent the house. And I know what you're thinking, but I couldn't move. Not right then, anyway. I was on the lookout for something else to open up, but I was stuck in the farmhouse for the time being. Every once in a while, I would hear what I thought was some kind of animal moving around outside of my house at night. Not surprising since I was so close to the park. It wouldn't really do anything, but it did get pretty close to the house on a couple occasions. And once I heard it get up on the porch and walk around. Now, I wouldn't exactly call myself a coward, but I wasn't about to go out there and confront it, especially if it turned out to be a bear or a moose. For the most part, it left me alone, and I was content with that. The time I heard it on the porch, I did turn the porch light on to try to get a glimpse of it, but it ran into the woods before I could. I didn't realize it at the time, but the creature did have a purpose for its visits. Whatever it was surviving off the carcasses that were being dumped at the end of the road. If it had enough food down there to keep it happy, it stayed at the end of the road, but when it ran out, it would go wandering. And that's when it would show up at my house. I called the local authorities and told them about the animal, and that I thought it might be dangerous. Essentially, they told me there was nothing they could do at that point. If it became a problem on my property, they would come out and destroy it, but since I hadn't even seen the animal at that point, they weren't going to do anything about it, so I stayed inside at night and tried to ignore it. I started documenting everything. I would drive down to the end of the road and record how much food the creature had that day. Without fail, when it ran low on food, it would show up around my house. This is when I started getting scared. I knew it was hungry, and whatever it was, it probably saw me as food, and I didn't know how far this thing was willing to go to get a meal. It was about a month after that when I heard of the bear attacks in the park. A couple of people got mauled, and several more had their cars, campers, and tents all destroyed by some rogue bear. I knew immediately that this was the animal that lived at the end of my road. The attacks all happened on nights where this thing didn't have enough food. I called the Park Service and told them of my theory, but instead of tracking down and destroying the bear, they just started feeding it more. But they couldn't keep up with it. There weren't enough casualties on the freeway to keep this thing fed, and its behavior started escalating. Instead of walking around the outside of my house, it started scratching at the doors and windows. One night I was afraid it was going to break down the wall and get in. I ended up calling the police. They came out and cleared the area. The officer told me that they were dealing with the situation the best they could, but it was going to take time and that I should just stay inside, away from the doors and windows until they could put the bear down. I remember the officer that spoke to me seemed frightened, like there was something else he wasn't telling me. The activity didn't stop, but I did notice that they were feeding it more. That seemed to help some, but it got so bad that I started feeding the beast myself there at the end of the road when it was running low, just to keep it away from me. It worked. I was wasting quite a bit of money on chicken meat, but it kept the creature satisfied. I drove out there every night after work to make sure it had enough food. I know it was stupid, but what else was I going to do? One night I went to drop a chicken off for it, and I was a bit later than usual. It was almost dusk. I never got out of the car, I just drove to the edge and threw it out the window. And that's when I finally saw it, and it wasn't a bear, not by a long shot. On first glance, it looked like a large wolf. It was hunched over on all fours, so it would have been easy to mistake it for one, but there was something odd about it that made me stay and watch it for a moment. I kept my car running so I could drive away in a second if I needed to. I remember its eyes. They were yellow, almost golden against dark fur that was either gray or black. I couldn't quite tell. It was waiting for me, watching me from between the trees. I threw the chicken out the window, but the creature didn't approach. It was waiting for me to drive away. I waited there for a couple of minutes, but the animal wasn't going to come out of the woods with me there. So I started driving off back down the road. I saw it in the rearview mirror. The creature stood up on two legs, just like a man, and walked out of the woods to grab the chicken. I couldn't get a good view of it from there, but it appeared to have usable hands, like it could grab things with them. It picked the chicken up and walked back into the woods. That's when I realized everything that was going on, why that officer was so afraid, why the park wouldn't do anything about this creature, and why this was the only rental available in the town. They were feeding it out here to keep it away from the national park. This was all on purpose. As long as it had a steady food source, it left everyone alone. When it ran out of food and would go searching in the park, they called it a bear attack. I lived in the house for another 6 months before I found a decent place to move, and I made sure this thing never ran out of food while I was there. I don't know what happened after I moved out, but I did make a stop down to the park and asked to talk to the rangers. I told them I knew about the creature in the woods, and that I knew it wasn't a bear, and that I had been feeding it just like they had been doing, but I was moving out soon, and it was going to be hungry. No one spoke a word to me. They didn't acknowledge they knew about the creature, but I knew they knew, and that was that. My grandfather Jedediah was a park ranger at Yosemite National Park during the 1930s. I've been diving into a trunk of his old belongings that's been sitting untouched in our attic since he passed away. It's a veritable treasure trove of letters, photographs, and notes, all weaving together a tapestry of his incredible life amidst nature's grandeur. Most fascinating among these artifacts is a letter he wrote to his sister Mildred in 1934. In it, he recounts an encounter with what can only be described as a Sasquatch. Reading his words, I can almost smell the pungent stench of the creature he describes, feel the raw, primal fear and awe that seemed to have enveloped him. His detailed account of this encounter, complete with a description of a skull of monstrous proportions, has left me baffled and, I must admit, somewhat shaken. The real kicker is an old photograph I found, tucked between pages of a worn leather journal. It's a picture of my grandfather standing next to an enormous skull. The enormity of it is astonishing. There's a look in my grandfather's eyes in that picture, a blend of terror and fascination that aligns so powerfully with the words he penned in his letter. Now here is his grandfather's letter to his sister, Mildred. June 14th, 1934. Dearest Mildred, I trust this letter finds you in good spirits. My time here in the spectacular landscape of Yosemite National Park has been filled with a blend of raw beauty and haunting wilderness that words can scarcely do justice to. However, Mildred, there are peculiarities to this wilderness, stories etched into the heartwood of ancient trees, whispers that curl around campfires, and beneath the luminous, watchful gaze of the stars, I too have a tale to share. I feel the need to document this experience as I am unable to shake its memory from my mind. The 6th of this month, a day like any other, was marked by an unexpected discovery. My day started under the radiant Californian sun, casting the splendor of Half Dome in sharp relief against the azure sky. Routine patrol took me through the winding paths around Mariposa Grove, where the giant sequoias stand as sentinels of the ages. In a clearing surrounded by these ancient titans, I was assailed by a wretched odor, an unholy melange of damp, rotting leaves and rancid meat. It hung heavily in the cool afternoon air, both familiar yet repulsive. The wilderness, for all its beauty, has its share of unsightly secrets. But the source of this particular secret was yet to reveal itself. In the heart of the clearing lay a monstrous skull, the likes of which I'd never seen. It was as if the ground had sprouted a monstrous parody of a man's head, broad and heavy, its form distorted and uncannily large, resting amidst a sea of rustling ferns. As I was absorbing this ghastly sight, there was a sudden crackling of underbrush, a shift in the shadows between the trees. And then there it was, an abomination, a grotesque mingling of man and beast. It towered over me a full 8 feet, covered in a patchwork of shaggy fur and leathery skin, its eyes glinting with an almost human intelligence. The creature seemed to embody the wilderness itself, wild, free, and indomitable. As terrified as I was, I couldn't help but marvel at this testament to nature's hidden wonders. Our exchange was fleeting. The creature retreated, melting back into the woodland as quickly as it had appeared. Yet, The impact of that encounter lingers, a palpable ripple in the otherwise serene fabric of my park ranger life. In these pages, I entrust you with my experience, dear sister. I find it best to have a record, a testament to the profound and unexplainable occurrences that nature occasionally discloses to her lone wanderers. Enclosed is a photograph of myself beside the unearthed skull, a testament to the enormity of what I've witnessed. I look forward to the day when we can speak of these occurrences in person. Until then, I remain as ever your affectionate brother. I'm reaching out to you because, well, I don't really know who else to talk to. My name's Jake, and I work at a gas station off Route 66 in Arizona. It's one of those places where tumbleweeds are more common than people. Now, I ain't much of a storyteller, but I gotta tell someone about the night that just about turned my hair white. So it was a regular Tuesday night, and I was working the graveyard shift. I was sitting behind the counter flipping through a car magazine when this old lady walks in. She looked like she was about 100 years old, all hunched over and wearing this big, heavy coat, which was weird, because it was like 80 degrees outside. She comes up to the counter and tells me in this raspy voice that something is coming. I'm like, "Ma'am, is there something specific you need help with?" She just keeps saying that something is coming and that I need to be ready. Then she turns around and leaves. I figured she was just a bit loony, you know. Fast forward a couple of hours and I'm restocking the shelves. Suddenly the lights start flickering and there's this weird humming sound. I thought maybe there was something wrong with the electricals, but then I looked outside. There was this thing standing by the gas pumps. It was tall, like real tall, and it was just standing there looking at the station. I couldn't make out much of its features, but it looked like it was made of shadows or something. Like it was there, but not really there, if that makes any sense. I locked the front door and grabbed my phone to try and take a picture, but the darn thing wouldn't work. The shadow thing started moving toward the station, and I swear the ground was shaking with each step it took. I don't know why, but I remembered what the old lady said about being ready. I didn't know what for, but I started thinking maybe this was it. I don't know what came over me, but I stepped outside and shouted, "Hey, what do you want?" The thing stopped and turned its head towards me. For a second, everything was silent. Then, in a voice that sounded like 100 voices all at once, it said, "Lost." Just that one word, but it felt like it echoed through me. I don't know why, but I pointed down the road and said, "Route 66 that way." The thing looked in the direction I was pointing, and then just like that it faded away into the night. The lights stopped flickering and the humming sound was gone. Everything was just normal again. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't know what it was looking for. But I think maybe it was just trying to find its way, like all of us. I haven't seen the old lady or the shadow thing since that night, but sometimes when I'm working the late shift, I think about them. I wonder where they came from and where they were going.